everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Seed Speaks. My name is Ashley Robinson, and I'm the editor of the Alberta Seed Guide, and I'll be acting as your host for this episode. On today's episode of Seed Speaks, we're going to talk about how consumer trends affect ag policy. We have a few guests here today to discuss this with us. Thank you to John Jamieson and Kent Schescke for joining us. And to those watching, please don't hesitate to ask any questions you may have for our guests in the chat box. And let's get started with getting to know our panelists. And so first off, John, can you tell me a bit about yourself and about the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity that you work at?
For sure, Ashley, and thanks for having me with you today. As you mentioned, I work for an organization called the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity. We're a national nonprofit organization based here in Canada. Our head office is in Guelph. And we have one purpose and one purpose only, and that's to connect the Canadian consumer with the food system. And we do that by offering research, communications, and resources to the industry and our members at large. Our membership is really broad-based. So we represent everything from government departments to farm organizations, to processors, to retailers. So we have a really broad base of membership. And again, our goal is to connect the consumer with the food system.
Thank you so much. And Ken, thanks for being here. Can you tell me a bit more about CAST and what your job is there?
Thank you. CAST is the Council for Agriculture, Science, and Technology. We're based in Ames, Iowa. CAST was formed about 50 years ago. We're a membership organization comprised of scientific societies, universities, nonprofit organizations. Many of those are representing either producer organizations, trade associations, commodity organizations of many kinds. We have a number of companies and lots of individuals that support our work. Basically, what CAST does is we bring together subject matter experts who help synthesize, summarize a lot of scientific information into easy to read, easy to understand, easy to access scientific information that hopefully informs good policy.
Great. Thank you so much. So I'm really excited for this conversation. So let's get it going. So first off, I'll just ask a general question and either one of you can answer it. So how much pull do you feel consumer thoughts have on the government when it comes to making policy?
Well, perhaps I can start, Ashley. And prior to joining the Canadian Centre for Food Integrity, I was actually a bureaucrat working in agriculture as a deputy minister of agriculture and fisheries in Prince Edward Island. And Prince Edward Island in Eastern Canada, the number one industry we have is agriculture. And, there's a couple of things that I think we should think about. One of them is that we are all consumers. Even if you're involved in the food system, a farmer, processor, we are all at the end of the day consumers. The other piece is government tends to reflect the wishes of the electorate who are consumers. So when you're developing policy in government, as I was responsible for several years, there's several things you take into account. One of them is, how does it impact the industry? Is it helping grow the sector? Is it making it more sustainable? But also a significant part of that is, are we meeting the needs of consumers? Are we helping our consumer connect with the food system? So consumer thoughts and priorities are taken into account by government, and often those thoughts and priorities are very similar to the people in the food system. Most people want to see the industry grow. They want it to be sustainable. They want it to be environmentally friendly, and it's not so we're often all in alignment in a lot of ways.
Thank you. And Kent, is there anything else you'd like to add there?
No, I think John kind of hit the highlights of it in terms of what the motivations are. I think there is probably some variance when you're talking about, the influence that they may have within the legislative branch, and in the U.S. that's our Congress and its state government levels. Because those people are elected, I think they probably are probably more attuned to consumer concerns, wishes, frustrations, whatever they may be. I think when you think about the executive branch, and particularly where departments of agriculture, whether it be at the federal or state level, these are the people often professional scientists, people who are often their role is to enact a lot of the laws and the policies that come out of their legislative bodies. I think that's where they're weighing some of the same things that John talked about, but probably in that case they're really taking a little bit more data-driven, science-based approach to how they craft programs that do not only serve the production agriculture community, but also take into account the interests that consumers have and the broader public.
Thanks so much. Some really great points you guys made there. I learned a lot myself just listening there. And let's talk a bit more about the consumer. So when we look at consumers, do you find that they're making choices on what they eat or support ag-wise based on science or personal perceptions that they may get from, let's say, social media or something?
Maybe I'll lead off. I think the role of science plays a role, but it's not often the driving role. Science is just one of the things that factors into it. A lot of it's personal preference, their value systems, their cultural, their lifestyle. All of these things, I think, kind of go into this. And I think sometimes while the science, as a scientist and people that work in the science community, we think it should all be primarily driven by science. Why not? That makes sense. But I think when we look at this from a consumer standpoint, how they make decisions, how they're influenced is very multifactorial. And I think sometimes we don't fully understand the complexity of what goes into these decision-making things that happen.
That's really interesting. I like how you said that we don't always think about all the complexities that go into making these decisions and how, as a person, we make our choices of what we eat or do. John, is there anything else you'd like to add there?
No, I think Kent nailed it. One of the other things that we see in the research we do is that there are very few consumers have a very solid knowledge of how their food is produced. So we know that about 91% of Canadians, in fact, have little or no knowledge of food production and what goes into food production. What we do find, though, is that about 60% of them want to know more. And that's an opportunity for the food system to speak to the consumer in one voice. But, like Kent said, people are making some decisions based on science, based on values, personal preference. What we're seeing right now with inflationary pressure across Canada, people are also making decisions based on their pocketbook, because we know that Canadians and people around the world are worried about food inflation and inflation in general. And they're changing their buying habits based on those pressures as well.
Thank you. And we just got an audience question that actually works with the next question I was going to plan on asking. So Alex Martin Hahn asks, since y'all have already mentioned that decisions are decided by consumers, how should the industry help manage fear that can pop up with new food production technology without overwhelming them with the science side? And the question I was going to ask, which I think relates to this, is what role does the ag industry have to share information with consumers and those making policy? So I'll just throw that out there and let whoever wants to answer it first.
Well, I think the general answer is I think we can help assure people that their food system is safe. I think there's often people perceive that a regulatory environment works counter to the needs of producers, but I think in a lot of areas, producers or people on the production side actually appreciate the work that a regulatory environment does, because it does clearly outline the rules and it helps ensure food safety. So I think this idea of making sure that we communicate the safety that goes into not only the production of our food, the processing of it, all those things that takes to get food from farm to the consumer's plate. Science plays a role of it, but I guess I would read the question. Sometimes we can go overboard on the science. And often, if we go too deep into science, we're creating confusion, not necessarily clarity. One of the things we try to do at CAST is how do we make the science more accessible and understandable? There's no shortage of scientific information, but I think often how we present it and how much of it we present, how do we present it in a way that people can relate to, is key to helping them at least feel a little bit more comfortable that there are people out there, both producers, processors, regulators that are helping ensure at the end of the day that the food is accessible, is affordable, but most importantly, it's safe to eat.
Thank you. And John, do you have anything to add?
I think the regulatory piece is really important. We know from asking our consumers in Canada, why do you think the food system is heading in the right direction? And they'll often cite the safety and the regulatory system we have in place. I think one of the other things that we need to do is communicate better on our values, and that we value safe, wholesome food at an affordable level. And often innovation, new technologies that we develop in food production is supporting food affordability and food availability. And I think that messaging is important as we communicate to the consumer. The other thing I think we need to do a little better job of is speaking with one voice as an industry. We need to think about, are there some common topics that we can speak on? For example, sustainability, food affordability, innovation. Those are areas I think that all our sectors are advancing and communicating. The other thing I think we need to do is make sure the consumer knows that we're on a path of progress. And I often say progress rather than perfection. And not to be shy away from saying, we don't have this quite right, but we're on the right path. And I think that builds credibility with the consumer and helps advance their messaging.
Thank you. And that plays into another question I really want to ask when you were saying about how we need to present a united voice when we're sharing this information. What can the ag industry do to share credible information with policymakers or with consumers? Like, how do we share that information? Because I know we talk a lot about it, but like, are there certain avenues we should do? Are there certain ways we should go about our messaging?
I think it's framing the information in terms of the larger challenges that often they're focused on. If it's environmental sustainability, what are we doing to better manage our resources to really, at the end of the day, lessen the impact on the environment of agricultural production, at the same time providing affordable, safe, abundant food supply. And the other one that I think we often maybe overlook is the idea it's not just about the quantity of food, it's the quality of food. And we think about not in terms of food systems, but we really think about nutritional security and how are we providing wholesome, affordable food that at the end of the day meets the nutritional needs, ends up with a more a healthier society. And I think the other part is often looked at is that the importance of producing food that can move around the world, because in the U.S. and Canada we're very fortunate. We have an abundance of food, but that food is often needed by people in other parts of the country, and I think helping them understand the importance of not only what we do but why we do it. And I think farmers today are very proud of the fact that now we have the ability in North America to not only produce food for ourselves, but the food that we produce does help feed people around the world.
Thank you. John, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think we're all on the right track in that we need to think about how we can speak with a united voice and be proactive in talking about the merits of the food system. There are times, though, when there is misinformation that's being presented to the public that we need to correct and speak out on. And I think we maybe have shied away from that in the past, thinking that if you don't talk about it, then you're not amplifying the message. But I can't express enough how important it is for this sector to speak with a united voice and to talk about how important it is for us to have diversity in the food system. So that there's no real right answer. There's room for conventional production. There's room for organic. There's room for small farms. There's room for large operations. There's room for plant. There's room for animal protein, and that diversity makes us strong and allows us to be able to, as Kent mentioned, produce food for people in our own countries and around the world.
Thanks. And one thing that I've been thinking of is do we have to address how we're talking to when we're talking to consumers or to ag policymakers differently? Like, is there different ways that we should be looking at our messaging when we're going to those avenues?
Yeah, I think there is. I think so often, we talk about particularly new technologies, new innovations. We really talk about those from more of a societal benefit. Often it's easy to produce a brochure or information that goes to farmers that explains the agronomic benefits or the production benefits. But I think we have to make sure that we're really talking about new science, new technology, new innovations that are coming down in food and agriculture, kind of in this context of the societal benefit that they produce. And that's aligning it to, what are the things that society is asking of its food supply, whether it be, sustainability, affordability, safety, all those things. We need to make sure that we're presenting those in terms of how they help fulfill this larger societal benefit. Because at the end of the day, back to one of the early comments that John made about, what are the drivers that are just our policymakers are working on. They're really looking broadly at all of their constituents and making sure that the policies or the things that they enable are benefiting their constituencies broadly, not just people who are working in production agriculture.
Those are all really good points, and I like how you said about the societal, and then tying it back to John's points earlier about how when ag policymakers are looking at making decisions, they need to be able to see the big picture, and sometimes we have to be able to get out of our little ag world boxes and look at how this affects the whole society and not just our own community or our neighbor down the road. John, is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think we've touched on it. The other thing to remember is that policymakers are consumers as well, and we're all consumers. And so when we think about communicating to consumer and policymakers, and I think by and large we do a really good job as a sector in communicating to our policy people. Most of our bureaucrats that are involved in agriculture and the food system are there because they're committed to seeing growth in the sector, but they're also committed to seeing a sustainable, safe food supply. So I think we're all on the right track, and we do a really good job of communicating to policymakers. I think sometimes we forget the role that the consumer plays in developing policy, and we think about messaging the science and the benefits that it has to the sector, but as was mentioned earlier, we need to think about the overall societal benefits and do a better job of communicating that as well.
Thank you. And I think let's look a bit more internationally right now, because of course we are all of us here are based in North America and stuff, but ag is not just a North American thing. So when we're looking internationally, is there any countries that you feel balances consumer perceptions and science well when making policy decisions?
John, I'll let you take the lead on that one.
Well, I actually think Canada does a really good job. It's not international, but I think we do a really good job of that. I think New Zealand, Australia, and some other countries do a really good job, and we can look at some countries that do a really poor job of that. And then, you think of the Sri Lankan experience that they've had in making decisions to go 100% organic without really thinking it through, and nothing against the organic sector. But all of a sudden, farmers did not have the tools available to them, and actually had to start importing rice into a country that was food secure in rice. Some of the policies that are made in the EU are not necessarily based on sound science, and some of the challenges they're having in Mexico. So it's probably easier to identify areas or countries that are doing a poor job of policy making, but by and large, I think we should have, both in Canada and the U.S., should be pretty proud of what we're doing, and I think a lot of cases countries look to us as an example of how to build policy that factors in the growth in the sector, the needs of the industry, and the needs of the consumer.
Yeah, I would second John's comment on that. I think in North America, U.S. and Canada, I think we're pretty fortunate to have a science-based approach, that does make sure that we are taking the proper, precautions or safeguards in food supply, but not, being too extreme in those views. When I look internationally, I'm not as familiar with all of these companies, but recently we've been working on a project on a paper looking at maximum residue levels and come into contact with several in the regulatory community, and particularly Australia, I think has done a good job of, I think, balancing, this approach and taking a consumer approach. So that would be my response to your question.
Thanks. I learned a lot there. I was really interested with the Sri Lankan information that you were sharing there, John. I had no idea that was happening. So that was really interesting. And going off that, you mentioned the European Union. So my next question is, we've saw regions of the world, such as the European Union, make wide sweeping ag policy changes in recent years. Thoughts on what we saw happen there? And is there any concern we could see something similar happen here in North America?
Well, just to start off with, and actually we've done a paper cast. I don't know if you can see it, but it's a paper really explaining this idea of the precautionary principle, and maybe comparing, contrasting that to a risk-based assessment that we use. One is science-based, one is not. And I think understanding that, because this helps kind of explain a lot of the regulatory differences we see around the world. I think part of it is we've seen some challenges to Europe's approach of recent, particularly as food supply chains have become threatened. That the more we do to restrict them, there is a downside to it. That when we get into times where our supply system is challenged, it points to the frailties or the weaknesses in those systems. And I think there's a lot of discussion about maybe rethinking some of these restrictive the environments, and making sure that, particularly at times of food supply crisis like we're seeing now as a result of what's happening in Ukraine, that we need to make sure that we have systems that allow for free and fair movement of food and trade around the world. And that may, stepping back a little bit from some of our paradigms on how we view and regulate food, I think is appropriate. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, really interesting there. I'm getting, of course, we're seeing loads of headlines about food security because of the war in Ukraine and everything. So it's very pertinent topic to right now. John, is there anything else you'd like to add?
Well, I think about a growing population in the world, and the fact that people need shelter, water, and food every day to survive. And the fact that we have to be conscious that we do not take the tools away from our producers that allow them to produce at a level that that we're going to need going forward. We're not creating any more agricultural land, so we need to get as much production as possible per acre in a sustainable manner, of course. And also meeting the challenges that we're having with climate. So I do worry that some of the decisions that are made in the European Union that are not necessarily based on science, that they could find their way to North America, because we often see that trends or trends for the most part that happen in Europe often find their way to North America, not too long after. And it's imperative for us as an industry to make sure that our farmers and food producers have the tools available to them to be able to produce in a sustainable manner. And often, what we're doing with genetic modification, gene editing, different tillages, changes with fertility, all of those advances make food more available and affordable to people around the world. And we got to be careful not to take those tools away.
All really good points. Sorry.
I would like to add to that. I think sometimes the regions of the world that suffer the most because of this, some of these limitations, has been the countries and the regions of the world that probably need it the most. Mm-hmm. You take Africa. I think because of the history of Africa and for many years, the European influence, they've been very hesitant to really look at some of these new plant breeding technologies, gene editing, some of these other ones that, have the potential to just make huge changes in how food is produced. And it's been heartening, I think, over the last 2 or 3 years to see some of these companies changing course and allowing more of these technologies into their country, because those are things I think that will help ultimately build more stability and more resiliency within their systems. And so there's a case of rethinking their approach to the regulatory environments and how they help ensure safe, abundant food supplies for their consumers is important.
Yeah, those are some really good points. And I think that ties back to one earlier when we were talking about how when we're sharing the ag story and the benefits of it, we need to look at it from a societal viewpoint. We can't just look from our own little silos and be like, well, this affects me this way. And we see that with sometimes with countries, they only think about how it's going to affect them. And they don't always think about the sprawling effects on countries like you mentioned, Kent, that may not have the resources to be able to make some of the choices that some of the bigger powers in the world are making.
Yeah, I think that's an important part, and I think we think about, John mentioned the tools in the toolbox. There's a lot of great tools and technology out there. They aren't always accepted or be able to use in all parts of the world, or even when we produce food in North America, the ability to export that to other parts of the world is somewhat limited because of those. And so I think, how do we help create a level of understanding and acceptance so that not only the farmers that we work with and work in North America have access to those tools, but also a lot of these technologies are scale neutral and can be used by smallholder farmers in Africa and other regions. We just need to make sure that those technologies are able to flow across borders and that they have these tools in the toolbox to help them produce safe, abundant supplies of food.
Thank you. And this conversation has been so fascinating. I really loved how we started kind of with our small picture, just talking about North America and our own experiences, and then got into that global aspect. I really learned a lot myself just chatting with you guys there.
Thank you. Pleasure to be on your program today.
Yeah, and unfortunately, everyone, that is all the time we have for today. So thank you to John and Kent for being here. And for those watching, thank you for tuning in. And if you missed part of today's live stream, don't worry. We'll have it available on demand on Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn. And if you have any questions about the subject or ideas for future topics we should tackle, please send a message to Seed World's Facebook page or feel free to reach out to myself. And next week, we will have my colleague, Ali Roden on, and she will have some guests on to talk about ugly produce. So we hope you'll join us. And thank you, and see you next week.